Get to him. Hey everyone. Some technical challenges here, but we're working through it. We're working through it. Thanks for your help, guys. Appreciate that. So hopefully everybody's settled in, enjoying some lunch. So thanks for joining us. Today I'm going to be speaking about maintainer burnout, essentially. As you can see, my shirt, Pay the Maintainers, is kind of the thing that we focus on at my company called Tidelift. And we're going to be talking about the XZ utils hack and really the dangers of open source burnout, right? Open source software burnout. So I'm going to start here with a kind of a fun fictional story. So this is Bob. If you can't tell from his forehead, he's a little stressed out. And just imagine that Bob is your airport security screening line repair guy. And he's stressed out because the security screening systems have broke yet once again for the second time this month. And unfortunately, nothing can be done with those screening machines until Bob, who's an unpaid volunteer, comes and fixes them. The challenge is Bob has a full-time day job. He works at Best Buy fixing laptops. And so that leaves him with nights and weekends. And then only, of course, when he's not coaching his daughter's soccer practice. So no one gets screened. No one's flying out until Bob's girls' soccer practice is over. Sounds reasonable or crazy, I don't know. But what's crazier is this is what exactly we've all accepted as normal when it comes to the security of our open source software that we're building all of our applications upon. If you're not familiar, our global software infrastructure used by many of you in the room and really every corporation on planet Earth at this point is built upon the backs of these unpaid labor as we know them as open source maintainers. So just like our example with Bob, our flight screener, just same way he's charged with fixing critical systems only at, again, nights and weekends and when he's not coaching practice, open source maintainers are dealing with the same challenges as they're trying to make sure that your critical infrastructure is up to date. And so the thing we're going to be talking about today is how these maintainers are somewhat in trouble. And many of these unpaid volunteers who first got into open source because they thought it was fun, and it is, right? It can be fun. But as they see more success around their projects, the thrill of the first few people using their code, then hundreds of people using their code, and then thousands and then millions of people using their code, what happens is they tend to get flooded with inbound requests, PRs, security vulnerabilities that might be found, and the stress, it starts to build up, just like our character Bob, who's at the flight at the airport. So before they knew it, what seemed to be a fun trip to the beach really becomes an unpaid full-time job. And so it begs the question, how do we get here to begin with? Well, over the past 25 years, open source software, it's becoming more and more prevalent in all of our applications we build. I'm sure some of you have seen these stats of 98% of applications contain some sort of open source component, and it's not a small amount, right? Upwards of 70% of the code could be made of these open source components. And Harvard Business Review just earlier this year published a really interesting piece where they deemed the entirety of the open source economy, open source software economy, at $9 trillion of resources that companies kind of take for granted. And that's great, because that means open source is working, right? We're saving lots of money and we're innovating at large scale. But by comparison, if you think about our US highway system, that is valued at $742 billion, and the entire US electrical grid is valued at $1.5 to $2 trillion. So that's why this is so interesting that open source software is growing at this speed. And while it's interesting, it's also frightening at the same time to think it's being supported by these unpaid volunteers. And again, this is not just your corporations using open source, governments around the world, even in our up-and-coming weapon systems, these are being used, open source being used in vast quantities. So I'm going to paint a picture of the, kind of a backdrop, if you will, with what happened earlier this year with XZ utils. Is everybody or people familiar with XZ? Okay, we got some folks that are familiar. Great. I'll just review it for those who might not be familiar. So XZ utils is a set of commonly used open source compression tools. The particular hack that was demonstrated with XZ earlier this year was quite elaborate, and it was really a devious social engineering hack that took years to carry out. It involved multiple fake aliases, and it was basically preyed upon who else but these overworked, unpaid open source maintainers. One of these fake aliases, which went by the name of Gia Tan, built trust with Lassie Collins, who was the person who was supporting XZ for many years. And this fake alias Gia, he was contributing useful code for a multi-year period. There was another alias that we'll talk about here in a moment that really harassed Lassie Collins, asking why more work wasn't being done and why he wouldn't let other people kind of take over and help with the project. And we'll go into a little more specifics there, but luckily the hack was discovered early by a Microsoft engineer who just happened to notice that some of his code was running slowly and tracked the issue back to XZ, or we would have had a potential catastrophe. So as I mentioned, this was a social engineering hack, and this is a screenshot, an example directly from Lassie Collins, kind of threads on his GitHub. So here's an example of one of the exchanges where he says, and I'll just read this out loud, progress will not happen until there is a new maintainer. The current maintainer lost interest or doesn't care to maintain anymore. It is sad to see for a repo like this. And so that was a fake alias, kind of egging this along. And then Lassie Collins, who again was the maintainer who's been maintaining it for a number of years, said, I haven't lost interest, but my ability to care has been fairly limited, mostly due to long-term mental health issues. Recently, I've worked off-list with Gia Tan on XZ utils, and perhaps he will have a bigger role in the future. And this is really important. It also is good to keep in mind that this is an unpaid hobby project. So lots to unpack there, but essentially, this is where the manipulation started to happen, right? We got the early signs that this person's thinking about moving away and can be easily targeted. And again, he talks about being an unpaid hobbyist. So today I want to show you what the risks caused by unpaid and overworked open source maintainers are not just isolated incidents to XZ. If you care about open source, which is probably why you're here, and want to keep it healthy and make sure you can continue to use it in the future, you need to understand more about the experience that open source maintainers are going through. So we just released our annual Tidelift State of the Open Source Maintainer report last week, and this is our third time releasing this report. So the great news is I'm going to go through not only some of the findings from 2024's report, but also show you some trend data from what we've seen in previous years. If you want a copy of the report, I'm going to have a QR code that you can scan at the end, or come find me and we can make sure you get an email version of it. So let's dig in. I want to take a poll from the audience, though. What percentage, before we get into some of the stats, what percentage do you all think, what percentage of open source maintainers do you think are not getting paid today? Not getting paid. Anybody think 10%? 90? We got 100. I feel like an auctioneer. This is fun. We got 10, we got 90. So that's two sides of the spectrum. Well, if you were thinking about 60%, you're dead on. So 60% of open source maintainers that we surveyed, 400 globally, reported not being paid for their work. So that means 60% of the open source maintainers that you rely on are dealing with the same kind of troubles that Bob, our make-believe volunteer, flight screener, is dealing with. And so I want to underline that. So again, the majority of maintainers are not being paid, and only 12% of maintainers that we surveyed think about themselves as professional maintainers. And that means they're making most of their income from maintaining their projects, and 24% consider themselves to be semi-professionals who earn some or some of their income from maintenance work. So if you think most maintainers are getting paid today, like the 90% person, you're actually incorrect. And the unpaid maintainers are actually more the norm than the exception. And what that means for you is, the things that you're relying on, your applications, that's an important risk factor. There's a lot of great solutions out here that you've seen all week, but a lot of them aren't really considering the human person, right? The person who's actually developing this code, and how do we, work with these people to actually improve this from the start, right? Just like any other software, any other supply chain, right? Any other supply chain, you got to work with the supplier. And I'll just call up one other thing. There's also no guarantees that they're going to continue to work in the future, right? So that's the other, I think, challenge with unpaid hobbyists is they could just move away from their project at any time. That doesn't mean there's like a CVE, doesn't mean there's a security vulnerability, but if they decide to delete their package or they decide to just abandon it, that could have an impact to your business. So a bit more scary news to underline. We also asked maintainers what they dislike about their work. And I'm not going to dive into all these. I'm just going to talk about the top 3 things that we heard directly from maintainers of what they dislike about working on their open source projects. The number 1 is not being financially compensated enough. So that's not a surprise. I mean, we all are here hopefully getting paid from our organizations and companies, but these maintainers aren't always, and that's their number 1 dislike. The number 2 is just feeling underappreciated or like the work feels thankless. And I think we could all appreciate that. And then the third one is that it adds more personal stress to their lives, right? Because again, it's kind of counterintuitive. They get into it to scratch an itch or something, and then it takes off, and then they feel the stress of it becoming popular. So what's the result of these maintainers not getting paid and feeling underappreciated? So we asked also the question, have they considered quitting their maintenance work around their projects? And a similar number, 60% of the maintainers that we surveyed reported that they have considered quitting or have quit their projects. And so that's a pretty scary number. Again, when you think about the open source projects that you rely on today, what would happen if the maintainers were to quit tomorrow? What's the impact to updates to your code? What does that mean for you? If there was a vulnerability discovered, how do you deal with that if there's no community or there's no maintainers on that project? So this is a graphic that we actually commissioned from our friend Forrest Brazil, and he really did a nice job in a cartoon fashion of kind of explaining at the beginning, right? You can see on the left there's this peak motivation, right? They're excited about their project. They're doing something innovative. They're doing something that they think is gonna help out the open source community. But the counterintuitive part or the disconnect here is as the project gets gets more people using it and no one's paying for their work, they quickly hit what we call that burnout zone. And so that's the disconnect, right? The more popular a project becomes in open source, if the maintainer isn't getting paid, their workload increases without any additional benefit to them. And so it's no wonder that 60% of maintainers have quit or have considered quitting. And meanwhile, another interesting stat, again, because we've been doing this survey now for multiple years, is that the population of maintainers is also aging. So if you see this visualization here, we did one in 2021, 2023, and 2024. We skipped a year 2022 if you recall what happened then. But the blue curve is from our newest survey, and if you compare that to our original survey in 2021, you can see that the community of open source maintainer is getting older, but the maintainers are not being replaced with new maintainers. In fact, the percentage of maintainers under 25 has halved, while the maintainers in the 36 to 45 range and the 46 to 55 range has grown substantially since our first survey. So another just thing to consider as you are building with open source is your companies are maturing. If we're not considering how the open source community is kind of dealing with some of this pressure, you could have a considerable amount of potential tech debt. So we also asked maintainers how long they've been working on their projects, and this is also a little bit of concerning data, we believe. 45% of maintainers have been doing work for more than 10 years, 24% 6 to 10, but only 9% of maintainers have been doing their projects for less than 2 years. So if your organization is using open source in your work, you should be thinking to yourself beyond, what is the risk of the maintainer of projects that I rely on quit, but you should also be asking, what is the risk of the maintainers of the projects I rely on retiring and aren't being replaced by a new generation of maintainers. So something to consider. So my story about Bob, the volunteer airport security repair guy, was actually inspired by a report from 8 years ago from the Ford Foundation. And this report was called "The Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor of Our Digital Infrastructure." And the author here used the metaphor of our public infrastructure like roads and bridges and airports to make the case that our open source code must be invested in the same way as other public infrastructure requirements. And when they released it in 2016, I think they meant this paper to be a warning, but this paragraph on the front page is worth highlighting because it's now 2024, and I don't know if we've really made a lot of progress here. So I'll just read you the challenge here. So free and publicly available source code is the infrastructure on which all digital society relies. It is vital to functioning our governments, private companies, and individual lives. However, few realize that the public good code, is built and maintained almost exclusively by unpaid maintainers, and the enormous amount of work is required in need of institutional support. So without effective support for coders work on publicly available projects, not only will their labor go uncompensated, but the digital world risks security breaches, interruptions, and service. And we've seen that, right? Again, this report's from 8 years ago. We've seen Log4j. We've seen other incidents of burnout and what happens when we're kind of leveraging open source and not thinking about the open source community. So what can we do about this? If you're worried about open source that you rely on, is there anything you can do? Well, the good news is we also, I'm going to share some stuff with you here. We know for a fact that actually paying the maintainers, it works, right? Just like we all work harder when we get compensated, the maintainers have responded really well to the idea of doing more professional, kind of enterprise grade security and hygiene to their projects if there's a compensation and an incentive. So, so here's some additional data points I want to go through, and the headline here is really that there's 3 areas that we're seeing money flowing into open source projects. The one is around donation. And donation is great. Any money going to open source is fantastic, but the challenge with donations is it's just, like very much driven by the economy, right? When the economy is good, people like to tip more. When the economy is poor, people are a little more tight. And so we see the same problems in open source donations, that it's not consistent during different ebbs and flows of the economy and different, election seasons and all this kind of stuff. The second place we see money flowing into open source is actually from some organizations' salary and wages, where they're employing certain individuals to support open source projects that they're using internally. And that's great. However, the challenge there is when there's new leadership in an organization and they're thinking about new leadership, new direction. You guys have all been through this, right? They might say, we're not going to invest in that open source project anymore, so that people lose jobs or they get repurposed to other things, and then that community potentially around that open source project goes away. And so salary is good to the point where they may end up moving away. The third is efforts like Tidelift, which again is the company I work for, where we pay maintainers on a recurring income stream. So what we do is we partner directly with the maintainers that are open to it. They agree to a contract that they sign with us, and now they're on the hook to provide more professional services, if you will, around their practices and development principles. So if you're under the impression that other people are paying for open source maintainers and you don't have to worry about it, hopefully this chart sets it straight that we all have to think about how we're going to engage with open source maintainers at our organizations, because if companies aren't paying foundations, there's a lot of money that goes to foundations, and that's great, but actually if you look at it, only 3% actually end up flowing to the maintainers themselves. A lot of them go for training and conferences and all that good stuff, but a small percentage of foundation money actually flows to the end developers. And the government, even though we spoke about the case that we should treat this as public infrastructure, only 1% of money that's going to open source maintainers is coming from government funds. And there are some efforts underway, both in the US and in Europe and other places, to engage more public dollars to open source maintainers, but that's going to take a long time, as you know, with anything related to the government. And the last data point I want to point out here, and if you think back to the roads and bridges metaphor, is that perhaps we should consider it more as critical as roads and bridges and water supply, and think about how we can work with government so they understand that this is a public good that they need to invest in along with your businesses. So maintainers have also indicated it's not just about being paid, right? I mean, we all love being paid at our jobs, of course, but we also like recognition. And so that's the other piece that open source maintainers reported to us, is that almost all maintainers, when asked if they would complete ongoing security and maintenance tasks with predictable income, they have said yes. And things like Log4j happened a few years ago, and if you look at the time around Log4j, there was a ton of money pouring into that project and surrounding projects, but as soon as the incident kind of recedes from the headlines, the donations stopped. And so the maintainers are back to where they started, right? And this is where we believe recurring investment is much more critical than just kind of like pointing a spotlight when something happens. And so this is actually the one of the maintainers from Log4j. His name's Gary Gregory, and he said, "I think the recurring income piece is critical for me. At least just imagine what it's like to have a job with a recurring income. It makes you feel safe, secure, and confident that you can keep on going and doing this work, and it's not just time wasted. It also lets you plan ahead, right? Just like our businesses plan. Everybody's in budget season right now, so you're planning for next year. Maintainers could also take advantage of that, right? More capabilities in their projects, more people that they can recruit. So you're probably thinking everything I've told you so far is, wow, that really sucks, and maintainers are feeling that way, and there's so many are getting paid. I doubt many of you are thinking, suckers got your code for free. So in my experience, and I've been doing this for 5 years here at Tidelift, most people want to see a world like this, where on one side, organizations like yourselves can trust the health and security of open source code they're using in their applications, and on the other side, they'd love to see a world where open source maintainers are thriving, they're getting paid, getting recognized for the value they're creating for your organizations. And now we have a lot of evidence on when maintainers are getting paid, both the creators of open source and those who use it get what they need as well. So it isn't all bad news. Moving into some good news here, our top headline from this year's report is actually that paid maintainers are 55% more likely to implement critical security and maintenance practices than unpaid maintainers. So the good news is we know that there's a way to solve this. Now we're switching the paradigm, right, where if they get paid, they're much more likely to do critical security and maintenance. And this seems intuitive to us. The people who are getting paid for their work are willing to sacrifice their nights and weekends a little bit more because they're getting compensated. So the data's here, and you can, again, we'll share the report with you so you can see more of those stats. Another example, well, I'll ask a question rhetorically, like I'm sure, how many organizations in the room, have a code review process, right? Or before it goes live. I'm sure all of you have some sort of code review process. Well, it turns out only 27% of unpaid maintainers do this, many times because they're actually solo maintainers and there is no one else to review the code. So that number doubles when they are paid because now they can recruit more people and maybe even pay somebody to do a peer review process. Another example is less than half of unpaid maintainers have a security vulnerability disclosure plan. So half do not have a disclosure plan who are unpaid, but when they're paid, 2/3, 66% do have a security vulnerability plan. So again, it showcases that there are ways to fix this, but it does take investment from your organizations. So again, we all know that software security is a complex problem, and there's things that can go to ensuring security for your applications, but again, the one thing that we see overlooked time and time again is, how do we engage with the open source maintainers directly? And we have a few case studies that I'll end with here of just talking about some of the maintainers that we've worked with that do get paid and some of the results that we've seen. And before I get into some of those case studies, I do have this chart as well, which is, I figured I'd add this because, OWASP is obviously a standards, helping with some standards. There's another effort within the Linux Foundation called OpenSSF Scorecards. So beginning in 2022, Tidelift, we actually worked with OpenSSF scorecards, and we went to a group of maintainers that we worked with, and it wasn't a surprise that these maintainers were already outperforming the 2021 results, but as we began to pay them more money to specifically implement OpenSSF scorecard practices, by May 2023, as you could see, the average maintainers in our cohort, they had jumped from 3.3 on average to 7.2. So again, this was a very relatively short time frame, and we were able to show that the investment and the focus of asking them to do these principles is increasing their scores. And again, OpenSSF is a great program. So is NIST's Secure Software Development Framework. But if you're an open source Java maintainer, SSDF, I mean, you might be in Europe. Like that doesn't even, you might not even know about it. So we go and say, hey, we're going to pay you to do these principles, and you can see the results. So this is exactly what we've done here at Tidelift, and as you can see, there's a whole bunch of industry standards that we've bundled into our contract, and this is ever changing. Again, I've been with Tidelift for 5 years. At the beginning, there was no OpenSSF scorecard, there was no SSDF, so we had some ideas of how to improve the software supply chain ourselves, but now we're incorporating a lot of these industry standards, and there's no reason why we couldn't incorporate some of OWASP's standards in the future as well. So this is one of our maintainer partners. Does anybody use, do they know Jackson Databind? It's a Java library. You're familiar? Great. So you may recall, I mean, over the years, unfortunately, there's been a lot of vulnerabilities. If you notice, over the last few years, or a couple of years, there hasn't been as many. So this, if you're not familiar, it's a pretty widely used content reader for JSON. So a lot of the vulnerabilities were around remote code execution. So this added to the security risk of this project. And Tatu, who is the maintainer, he didn't have any compensation. As soon as Tidelift started working with them, we worked with him to put on two-factor authentication. We worked with him around developing better security development practices, including vulnerability fixes around the latest releases that he was putting out. And even better, when it comes to remote code execution, the concerns of our customers have gone down significantly. So we were able to see, as he was receiving income and devoting more time into his projects, he completely actually ended up re-architecting Jackson Databind to eliminate any risk. And the customers that we work with have reported that it had previously been on a list of packages that they needed to re-architect out of their applications because it had created so many internal risk calculation scores. But because we were able to work with Tatu directly upstream and get these things fixed, again, at the supplier level, they no longer had to re-architect their stuff internally. So again, like the investment you can make in open source maintainers will have an impact on your business because you don't have to do the re-architecture, you don't have to rip and replace different versions or different libraries. Another case study is around Minimist. And so this is one of our premier open source maintainers that we work with. His name is Jordan Harbrand. He actually lives here in the Bay Area. I should have had him come in today. I just realized that would have been fun. But he is local here, and we used to work for Airbnb and other San Francisco-based companies. And you may remember a while back, NPM had made the decision to start requiring maintainers of JavaScript packages to use two-factor authentication. And so while a lot of organizations applauded NPM and said, hey, that's a great idea, you should increase the package security, some of the JavaScript maintainers weren't so enthusiastic about it because requiring 2FA was just one more additional burden that was being placed on them. So for one particular maintainer, he was maintaining several high-profile packages, including this Minimist package, and his name was Substack. Jordan, who we already had been working with, he had caught wind that Substack was pretty bent out of shape about the two-factor authentication. One of the reasons was he actually didn't have a mobile phone, so he claims, I guess. I don't know if I believe that, but his lifestyle, he said, I don't have a mobile phone, so putting 2FA on would have been very difficult. And Jordan had caught wind of this because he relies on a lot of Substack's dependencies in his transitive list. And luckily, he caught wind of it, and while he had a moment of panic, he approached Substack and said, "Hey, could I take over those packages?" And at first, Substack was like, "No, I'm just moving away from it." And over time, he finally convinced him to hand over the rights. But it turns out in GitHub, there's no easy button to just transfer all of your packages and libraries to another owner. So he had to go one by one, and Substack was getting pretty annoyed by the whole process, and he ended up just deleting them. Jordan, saw him kind of getting deleted in real time and was kind of freaking out. Luckily, we were able to work with Substack, Jordan, and GitHub, and we were able to get everything transferred over. So these are the types of outcomes that you don't even know about because we kind of did this all behind the scenes. But now Jordan is getting compensated for these sets of packages, including Minimist. And the great news is, because he's getting compensated, Jordan's brought in some other maintainers to help him with the support. He's now following all of the requirements from Tidelift to get paid. So there's two-factor authentication, there's a coordinated disclosure policy, there's all these elements of professionalizing his open source work because Jordan is getting paid. One quick final story is that gentleman, Gary Gregory, right, from the Log4j project I mentioned. So this is part of, they're within the Apache Foundation. This is an image here. I'll let you guess where Gary started getting paid by Tidelift. So hopefully that figure speaks for itself. And what's interesting is we try to actually go and work with Log4j pre-incident, but at the time, maintainers within the Apache Foundation weren't able to accept money from outside sources unless it came through Apache. After the incident, we worked with the community through the mailing list process, and we were able to get them to change their kind of bylaws, if you will, to allow for outside money to come to maintainers. So that was an effort that, again, Tidelift, kind of spearheaded and makes a big impact. So now maintainers can get paid from Tidelift and other places. So again, I'm going to end here in a moment, but this is again the disconnect, maybe intuitive or counterintuitive. I don't really know, but you start the project, a lot of motivation, and then again, as it takes off, the pressures start to build. But there are ways that we can address it by paying the maintainers. So some things that you can do within your organization, some questions you can start asking is there a strategy to replace deeply nested open source projects if the maintainer isn't able to devote enough time to secure and maintain their projects? How much do you know about the security and maintenance practices followed by the maintainers, right? A lot of times we look at, is there a CVE? Is there, some security vulnerability? But we're not looking at the maintenance part. So that's a thing that you can go back to your organizations and start asking, do we know enough about the maintenance and the community behind these projects? You also might want to ask yourselves, what's the risk of abandoned packages or packages that are end of life, right? Do you have a strategy? Again, if 60% of your open source goes unmaintained, who would take over maintenance in the event that somebody does move away from their project? So the last thing I'll say is Louis Villa, one of our co-founders here at Tidelift, I'll just read, this is from a recent blog that we put out. In our experience, open source maintainers often start projects for non-monetary reasons, like the classic scratching an itch or because their bosses tell them to do so. But after starting the project for various reasons, they often maintain projects out of the sense of obligation, at least until the burden becomes too much and they burn out or quit. So to put it another way, no maintainers started their project because of the love of ensuring it complies with your company's definition of enterprise secure software development practices for no pay for the rest of their lives. If your company needs the level of secure practices that require the code to be written in your in-house development team, you are leaving the realm of software downloaded free from the internet and entering into the world of economic transaction, offering value for income in return. So again, I'll leave this up here for a moment. If you want to download our 2024 survey, please feel free to grab it from the QR code or come find me, or we got Will and we got Sean in the back as well with I think they have Pay the Maintainer shirts on. But we can get you a copy of this as well, so I'll just leave that up for a second more. See some folks grabbing it. Awesome. And then lastly, I have my contact information, and that's my QR code if you want to connect on LinkedIn. Be happy to talk a little bit more. Any questions? I think we have a couple moments. Any questions that I can answer? Great. Well, thanks so much, and hopefully this was helpful for you to understand a little bit more about what the open source maintainer community is dealing with and how we can address some of the challenges. Thank you.